All right. So welcome to tonight's presentation of the ASQ Phoenix program meeting. Tonight's guest speaker is Hilary Werner, a forensic scientist, and Hilary will be discussing the role and importance of quality in forensic science. So a little bit about Hilary. She's been employed as a forensic scientist by a large municipality for over 14 years. She served, I've got something blocking my screen here. Here we go. She served as a latent print examiner and is certified in her discipline to the International Association for Identification. During her career, Hilary has provided court testimony in over 40 cases ranging from petty offenses to crimes against individuals. Her interest in quality has also led her to obtaining a certified quality auditor certification. She's presented at local and regional conferences on oversight in forensic sciences, and more recently delivered a presentation on practices for the reduction of bias in latent print examinations. Latent print examinations, excuse me. She holds a BS in biology from Northern Arizona University and is currently working on a master's degree in organizational leadership with an emphasis in criminal justice administration. All right, so the abstract, so tonight's presentation is going to provide an overview of forensic science and evidence analysis, especially in light of the past 20 years. As she mentioned, television shows such as CSI and NCIS have gained immense popularity for their dramatized portrayal of crime scene investigations. But she's going to discuss how much of what we see in these shows is actually true to life, and how are crimes really solved using forensic evidence. So she'll be talking about the use of evidence in criminal investigations over the past several decades and how that's changed, explain how quality measures are important in maintaining the integrity of evidence, the methodology followed during analysis, and the accuracy of notes and reports. This presentation will also offer a brief discussion on standards development within forensic sciences and the significance of forensic laboratory accreditation. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Hilary, and welcome to our program meeting.
Thank you. Let me just get my PowerPoint up here. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to speak this evening. I'm truly grateful for it. And I realize that tonight's presentation is a little bit different than our regular fare, but I hope you will find it as interesting as I do. Let's see. Okay, as Bob mentioned, I am a forensic scientist for a large municipality in Arizona, well, in the Valley of the Sun. I have been working as a forensic scientist or as someone who compares latent prints for the last 14 and a half years for this organization. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in biology. And as I kind of mentioned previously, in this particular field, they do require that, that their scientists obtain some type of hard science degree nowadays. So as kind of a brief overview of what we're going to cover, Bob kind of touched upon it. We'll talk about what forensic science is, and then I'm going to go into some of the more standard disciplines and briefly run through what they do and how they process evidence. There is a lot to this presentation, as Bob mentioned, so some of these slides will fly through a little bit faster than others, so just bear with me on those. And if you have questions that you feel can't wait to the end, please feel free to put those in the chat box, and I will try as best as I can to pay attention to that while I'm going through the slides as well.
And if I could interrupt just briefly, if you're interested in obtaining a copy of this presentation, it is available on our MyASQ site. So if you log to my.asq.org/communities/home/244, or just search for Phoenix section, you will find a blog post that will then take you to Hilary's presentation, you can download it, view it. So it'll give you something to write in the margins if you're so inclined. So excuse me for the interruption, Hilary, go ahead.
Oh, you're just fine. Thank you so much. So what is forensic scientist? What do we do as forensic scientists? Forensic science is a science with multiple disciplines that applies science to law. So each of the disciplines in one way or another will use a scientific method to figure out what happened in a crime. They'll take the evidence from a crime scene and they'll look at it. In my instance, or in my example, I look at fingerprints. So I will compare prints that have been lifted from the crime scene to known exemplars of individuals, and using the scientific method or a form of the scientific method, I will try and figure out what individual left those fingerprints at the crime scene. As forensic scientists, we test, evaluate, and examine crime scene evidence. So that evidence will provide answers to questions about who, what, where, when, and how crimes are committed. And as I mentioned in my introduction, there are many types of science or many disciplines that are necessary in order to provide answers to these questions that result as these crimes come up. And one important thing to note is that forensic science is extremely important, because without it, we would be relying on eyewitness reports of what happened at crime scenes. And oftentimes those eyewitnesses just aren't available. So during those instances, this becomes very important. Now, a few of the more common disciplines in today's forensic science are crime scene response, or a team that goes out to crime scenes and looks at the crime scenes for evidence that may be important to processing that crime and potentially analyzing later back at the lab. There's also an evidence screening section, and depending on what lab you visit, these sections or these disciplines might have different names, but they essentially do the same thing. Evidence screening sections will look at evidence for biological material and fingerprint evidence, and they'll process that evidence and then send biological evidence to another section potentially for further analysis, and then send fingerprints to another section for further analysis. There's also forensic biology. Again, this is the section that processes DNA. So if there's biological evidence that's been processed by an evidence screening section, they'll then get that biological evidence to process for DNA. There's toxicology. They are the ones that are responsible for testing blood and alcohol or blood and urine for drugs and alcohol. And during that testing, they'll determine whether whether drugs and alcohol exist in blood and urine, and how much of each of those substances exist. And then controlled substances will actually do the testing of the drugs that come into the lab themselves. Then there's a firearms section, or there's a firearms discipline that will test firearms. And then, of course, my area of expertise is latent print examination, and we'll go into that in just a minute. And then there's also trace and arson. These people look at scenes where maybe there was a fire, or look at evidence such as fibers that can be analyzed further. So crime scene response. In many law enforcement agencies, this is a civilian team. It can be a sworn team, but in most law enforcement agencies, it is a civilian team that works with sworn officers. Because they work with sworn officers, they're required to follow the policies of the laboratory that they work in, as well as the chain of command on the sworn side. Many agencies do offer a 24/7 coverage to obtain evidence from crime scenes, because criminals do not take time off. This particular discipline doesn't take time off either. While they have people that work different shifts, there's always someone covering during the day. And they respond to different crime types, and their response to different crime types may be dependent on the agency size. So some larger agencies may be able to respond to less violent crime types, where some smaller agencies may only be able to respond to those more violent crime types and not so much to the other crime types. And this particular discipline responds to crime scenes to photograph, document, and collect evidence. So while they do collect evidence, they're also looking at other things at the crime scene that may be helpful in solving the crime. They use specialized photography techniques, and they specialize in different areas. There are many more areas than just the ones I've listed here, but some of the examples of specializations include buried body, post-blast, and bloodstain pattern. Once the evidence comes in from the crime scene response team or a similar team, it then goes through evidence screening, as I mentioned before, to be screened for biological evidence as well as latent fingerprint evidence. That biological evidence is collected with wet and dry swabs and then is forwarded for further processing to a DNA unit. The latent fingerprint evidence is enhanced using either chemicals or forensic light sources. And I should probably interject here that a latent print is often an invisible two-dimensional impression of the friction ridge skin on the fingers and palms and sometimes feet that is left behind at a scene. And in order to see that print, because it's invisible, it needs to be developed with different processes, whether that's chemical enhancement or enhancement with forensic light sources. And officers or people that respond to crime scenes are also able to develop those impressions using black powder as well, and then lift them on with tape and then place them on lift cards. They also collect and preserve trace evidence, and that trace evidence can include fibers, paint chips, tape, and glass, among other things. The forensic biology DNA section processes DNA. So their duties include extraction, quantification, amplification, and characterization of DNA. They look for DNA match between items found at a crime scene and a specific person. Now, when they're doing this, they can either identify the suspect or victim or use the DNA to exclude a particular individual at a crime scene. Now, they have a database that they use for their DNA profiles, and it's called CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. It contains profiles from crime scene evidence of convicted offenders, arrestees, missing persons, and also includes relatives of missing persons as well. There's a national system called NDIS, the National DNA Index System, that also contains DNA profiles from agencies that have submitted their collected profiles to them. And something interesting to note was that in April of this year, the 20 millionth DNA profile was entered into NDIS via a CODIS entry from another agency. Now, latent print examination, my area, we analyze latent prints collected from crime scenes, oftentimes as lift cards, as I mentioned before. Well, they'll dust an item in a crime scene, apply clear tape over it, and then apply that to a lift card. We also look at photos that have been submitted into a database by crime scene response and evidence screening. We look at inked prints on court documents. These are oftentimes priors where the prosecution is looking to obtain a stiffer sentence for an individual who is currently on trial for a crime that they committed. And we also look at prints on pawn tickets as well as checks. We have a couple of different types of analysis that we do. We can either enter prints into APHIS or compare prints to known individuals. APHIS is our database of millions of different fingerprint and palm records, kind of like you see on CSI. But this particular system itself contains about 3.8 million fingerprint records. This is the AZ APHIS database, the state database. Contains 3.8 million fingerprint records and about 960,000 palm print records. Interesting fact is that this database not only contains fingerprints and palm prints of criminals, it contains fingerprints and palm prints of anyone that is printed for business purposes. So that could be teachers, that could be lawyers, that could be doctors, anyone that works with kids. All of them contribute to the number of prints in this database. And then when we do enter a print to be searched in the database, results can take anywhere from minutes to days, depending on the complexity of the prints entered in the case. And then ASIAFIS, the state database, is linked to the national FBI database, which is known as Next Generation Identification. And that database contains about 80 million criminal records and 61 million civil records. So we've got quite a few records to search our fingerprints against that are lifted from crime scenes. We also have a firearms section, which examines firearms, ammunition, and related evidence. They analyze casings and bullets and do test fires of guns. They look at the head stamps, which are here on cartridge casings. They do gun when function tests, serial number restoration on firearms as well. When they are running their tests for gun function or doing comparisons of bullets, they will shoot those guns into water tanks so that they can collect the bullets later on. There's also a National Integrated Ballistic Information Network that will determine if a particular weapon is linked to past crimes. So this is basically their equivalent of what APHIS is to latent print examiners. They can search this database for their purposes. There is a controlled substances discipline that analyzes drug evidence to include marijuana, meth, prescription drugs, cocaine, steroids, and pretty much anything that you can think of as far as controlled substances are concerned. They utilize presumptive spot tests that basically demonstrate that the drug that they're testing is probably what they're looking for. And then they complete confirmatory testing using machines for gas chromatography and mass spectroscopy. When they receive bales of evidence into the crime lab, they don't test all the drugs and all the bales. They do core samples of the bales. Oftentimes we'll receive tons of bales and a drug shipment in the laboratory, and it would just require too much time and effort to test all the drugs and all those bales. So they do core samples. They also train field officers in the use of presumptive drug tests and TrueNarc. And TrueNarc is an instrument that actually is able to determine what type of drug is contained within a baggie or within plastic wrap or any other type of item. And then positive field testing by those officers allows for charges to be filed against the suspect, and those drugs can then be tested in-house further. There's a trace arson discipline that again looks at crime scenes for possible accelerants when there's fire involved. They also look at trace materials such as carpet fibers or paint chips or glass fragments. They rely on Locard's exchange principle, which says that if you enter a scene, you're likely to leave something behind from your person, and you're likely to take something from that scene out with you. And the photo that you have on the right side of the screen is a shoe, presumably one that's been at a crime scene that they're analyzing. And they're finding fibers that are stuck in the mud on that shoe. Again, presumably fibers that were at that scene that they can then analyze. Other types of testing that they do or comparisons that they do are on foot and tire tracks. If a car goes into a scene or drives into a scene and drives out, they can take casts of those tire tracks that are left behind if what they were driving on was a softer surface such as dirt or mud. They can take casts of those and then take them back to the lab and compare them to known exemplars. They also look at tool marks and they look at duct tape and similar items as well. And then they can do vehicular accident reconstruction with some of the older headlamps that had the filaments in them. And there's a toxicology discipline that, again, looks at blood and urine samples for drugs and alcohol, and they are able to use their instrumentation to figure out the amount of drugs or alcohol that are in someone's blood or urine, as well as the type of drugs that someone has ingested. And then something interesting to note is that this particular discipline it goes to court the most. These cases are the most litigated. So these people have, where I work, I've seen statistics saying that they've testified upwards of 200 times in a given year. So if you don't like court testimony, this is probably not, not the discipline for you. So why is quality important in what I do? Why is quality important in forensics? Quality measures ensure that correct steps are being followed during the testing of evidence. And this is important, especially when we have different disciplines, different sections that process different kinds of evidence. So in my section, again, we receive evidence in either from crime scene or from evidence screening or the officers. And it's important that those sections or those people follow quality processes throughout their processes so that when I receive the evidence, I know that what I'm receiving is of quality, and then my analysis and comparison can be conducted with quality as well. Quality is also important in what I do because we need to have results that are accurate and results that can be replicated. The scientific method says that the testing needs to be replicated. You need to be able to show that that what you're testing is positive or negative, not just once, but that it's positive or negative a second time or even a third time. And we need to ensure that bias is limited and mitigated. There are different things that can bias us in our science, and we'll go into that a little bit more here momentarily. And then when issues do present themselves in the process, they need to be quickly remedied. Otherwise, we'll run into more and more issues down the road. We also need to ensure that our testimony is accurate and unbiased. We are there to present, whenever we go to court, we're there to present what we've done in a case. We're not there representing the prosecution, and we're not there representing the defense. We need to make sure that we're just there telling them what we did in our case and are not biased either direction. And quality is also important to ensure that the integrity of the evidence is maintained throughout the system. And the evidence does have a chain of custody. We know where the evidence has been at every part of the process. And if something goes wrong with it, we need to be able to figure out where it was prior to us and go back to that person and remedy that. Quality measures ensure that the right people are punished for the crimes committed, and they prevent punishment of the innocent. That's the biggest reason that we need to have quality measures in place, because if there have been people that have been punished that weren't those that committed the crimes, as we'll come to find out. So some of the challenges regarding forensic evidence, the CSI effect. This used to be more of an issue back when CSI initially came out. It's not so much of an issue now, but it is still around. The CSI effect distorts the perception of jurors regarding the amount of evidence required to obtain a conviction. And it also puts ideas into jurors' heads about what types of evidence are required in a particular case. Sometimes the evidence just, like certain types of evidence just aren't available at a crime scene. So when people watch this show, they automatically expect that particular types of evidence will absolutely be at particular crime scenes, and that's just not always the case. The CSI effect also sometimes means that eyewitness accounts are undervalued during trial. And I've added a couple of cartoons. Whoops, Sorry about that. I've added a couple of cartoons throughout my presentation that are funny, but they're funny because they can be true. So, for instance, in this cartoon, the prosecution is saying there were 10 eyewitnesses. The suspect has motive, and his client pled guilty. He's guilty, and the jury still wants to know, where's the evidence? Like, you don't necessarily need all types of evidence in every single case. And then it makes for a more difficult jury selection. If people have expectations of what we're doing and we're not meeting their expectations, we don't want them to be biased going into trial. And then some of the more common types of bias that we deal with as forensic scientists are contextual bias and confirmation bias. Well, there are hundreds of different types of bias. These are the ones that I see affecting people the most, or have the potential to affect people the most in what I do. And contextual bias often involves the introduction of extraneous information about a case. So by that, I mean, a forensic scientist may be speaking with a detective or a case agent on a particular case that they're working, and that detective or case agent will mention some things about the case that they don't need to know about their particular analysis, but now they know this information about the case, maybe, for instance, where they think the suspect was at the time of the crime, or someone that saw him. And now we have those ideas in our head as we're conducting our latent print comparisons, and we have this name of this individual that the detective has also mentioned as being the person that was seen at the scene of the crime. And we really want to eliminate that type of bias. We want to make our examinations as bias-free as possible, so that when we do testify in court and we offer our findings, that that the conclusions that we've come to are based on the science and not our pre-existing beliefs. And then there's also confirmation bias. Well, as I just mentioned, this is a result of pre-existing beliefs about test results or a situation. And this can often occur as an example in my science is if I look at the exemplar, if I look at the known record prior to doing my analysis of the latent print or the unknown print, what'll often happen is I'll see those features in the known print and start looking for them in the unknown print. And that's really dangerous. We want to avoid that as much as possible. And I'll talk about some ways that we do that in the next few slides. So regarding additional challenges for forensic evidence, there was a report that was issued in 2009 by the National Academy of Sciences. And one of the things that was brought up in that report was, well, first of all, that report looked at ways that forensic sciences could be improved. And one of the things that they brought up is that we as forensic scientists don't have any standards that we follow. We don't have practices that are followed across the board. And so they're working to change that. They introduced OSAC, which is the Organization of Scientific Area Committees, a few years ago. And they are an organization with approximately 550 individuals and let's see, 22 subcommittees, and then 7 committees. And they're responsible essentially for coming up with standards that forensic practitioners are encouraged to follow. Now they're still in their infancy, so we're just starting to see the first standards out, and no standards have been published for my discipline, latent print analysis or friction ridge, but we are seeing some standards being developed in other disciplines, and they are encouraging forensic agencies to follow these standards, and these standards can be included in a laboratory's accreditation practices as well. So while there's no body that enforces these, again, they're all voluntary, if a lab includes them in their accreditation practices, then they must be followed. And so a couple of the standards development organizations that OSAC is working with include the Academy Standards Board, the American National Standards Institute, and then the American Society for Testing and Materials. And then some additional challenges regarding forensic science includes improved methods in science leading to exonerations. So as we move forward with forensic science, like anything else, it continues to improve. Our procedures improve beyond those that we've had in the past. Our technology improves, and as a result of that, there have been exonerations due to DNA as well as other improved disciplines. I looked at, when I was creating this presentation, I actually looked at some statistics by the Innocence Project, which is one of those organizations that is responsible for taking on cases where they think additional analysis will be beneficial to proving someone's innocence. And I've also looked at the National Registry of Exonerations to consider their practices for taking on cases as well. And in doing this research, I realized that since 1989, since the time that the Innocence Project has actually been looking into cases for reanalysis, there have been 375 DNA exonerations, and that's just due to better practices in that science. There have also been another contributing factor includes the misapplication of forensic science and misapplication of other disciplines of forensic science. And that was found in 52% of the cases that they've looked at. And then nationwide, 24% of exonerations are due to misapplication of forensic science. And this was actually a statistic that was brought about by the National Registry of Exonerations. And to date, they've had 2,891 exonerations. And so 24% of those are due to the misapplication of forensic science. And this is something that I borrowed from their website, just to kind of give you a visual of the effect that this has on forensic science. Again, there have been 2,880 exonerations since 1989, and that's in the United States alone. That's not including foreign countries. There have been 25,874 years that people have spent behind bars who were later proven innocent. And then in most of their cases, they found that there was an average of 9 years that the individual lost as a result of being incorrectly incarcerated. So again, another reason that it's important to practice quality measures in forensic science to make sure we get the right people behind bars and not those that don't deserve to be. So some of the benefits of DNA testing now, prime suspects in cases have the potential to be accused and pursued erroneously prior to DNA testing, and the DNA testing may actually clear them from involvement in the case. In 1995, the National Institute of Justice conducted a study of 10,060 cases. And what they found was that 25% of suspects were excluded following the testing that they did on DNA. So again, another plug for DNA testing. And then the Innocence Project reviewed closed cases from 2004 to 2015. And in their review of those closed cases, it was demonstrated that 25% of those cases were closed due to misplaced or destroyed evidence. So this is suggestive that maybe we need to have better practices with our storage of evidence as well. So here's an example of an individual that ended up serving time for a crime that was thought that he committed, but as it turns out, he didn't commit it, and he ended up serving 30 years as a result. So a woman was found stabbed to death after being sexually assaulted. She was found in her home by her live-in boyfriend at the time, and this happened to be a court reporter. Early suspects included 3 individuals, One of them was a known sex offender in the area who had ties to the apartment complex. One of them was the victim's boyfriend, and one of them was her husband. They had been separated at the time. And Alan was brought in for questioning a few days later after the crime occurred, after a chance encounter with police, because they thought he looked like the sex offender that they were trying to bring in for questioning. Later on, one of the detectives realized the mistake as they were conducting the interview, but continued to question him about the crime. And unfortunately, Alan, who had a history of mental illness, ended up confessing to killing her. Primary evidence at the trial was from a lab analyst whose testimony ended up being false. He testified that the biological evidence collected from the crime scene could not exclude the victim. It could not offer a high probability, though, of identification either. So it really wasn't, the evidence really wasn't all that great, at least for the DNA. And then the prosecution claimed in closing that the results of testing were consistent. This was the only evidence linking Alan to the scene. So when their closing arguments were basically saying that the DNA that we have is consistent with his DNA, even though it wasn't, the jury was led to believe that he, in fact, was the person, well, may have been the person that committed the crime. They also found in the investigation of this case that a coworker of the victim had stopped by that evening when the perpetrator was in the house. And hypnosis was used to try and improve that person's memory of that night, and whether or not she heard the name of the victim after or whether or not she called the name of the victim after she arrived, because Alan's testimony had said that he had heard a name called while he was there, even though he wasn't there. And the hypnosis revealed, or for her, it revealed that a name was in fact called. Now, the first trial, after this first trial ended, they favored acquittal, but there was a second trial that ended up resulting, and he was convicted. And at the second trial, he actually offered alibis to help his case, and those alibis were rejected. And he ended up serving 30 years as a result of that crime. And as you can see here, there were several things that went wrong with that case, and he was later released due to additional evidence and testing. But it's unfortunate that he served 30 years for that. So a little bit about objectivity and subjectivity in the type of work that we do. Forensic science is both objective and subjective. There are certain forensic disciplines that are more objective and certain disciplines that are more subjective. So those that are feature comparison disciplines, such as what I do, latent print analysis and firearms comparisons, those are oftentimes more subjective. The analytical disciplines like toxicology and controlled substances are often more analytical. It's important to note, though, that both types of disciplines do use some form of the scientific method for analysis, and I'll get into a little bit later what our form of the scientific method is. The more chemistry-heavy analytical sciences rely on instruments and machines to analyze evidence. And so their observation of results is more objective. They look at charts and graphs to analyze their results, and those numbers are provided to them. The feature comparison methods are often more subjective, as they rely more on examiner interpretation. So an examiner is essentially looking at an unknown and comparing it to a known again. And there are things that can happen with that unknown that don't necessarily align with that known. And so as they're trying to figure this out in their brains, what they see is often based on a number of different factors, such as training and education and experience. And of course, volume of cases analyzed as well. So this is a mass spectrometry chromatogram, a chart basically showing peaks for ethanol, methanol, isopropanol, acetone, and propanol. And this is what an analyst might see in a toxicology lab, and they would know that these substances were present in their sample based on these particular peaks. They are trained to look for these peaks for those particular chemicals. And so they know if they see them, they have them in their substance. Whereas in my particular discipline, this is what I might be looking at. So the print on the right side of the screen is actually an unknown latent print, essentially. And the print on the left side of the screen is the known impression. And so I would be comparing going from the unknown impression to the known. And of course, there's a lot more ambiguity in what I'm looking at as I'm trying to figure out if this print was made by that same person that produced the print for the exemplar print. There's much more distortion involved. It's only a fraction of what's available in the known print. And then we also have an example from Firearms Comparisons as well and what they look at. So this is an impression from a firing pin when a gun is fired into the cartridge. And these will often look very different depending on the type of gun that's being fired. But because of their expertise, they're able to analyze these impressions that the firing pin makes and are able to tell what looks similar and what looks different. And because I'm not a firearms examiner, I'm not going to tell you what looks the same or what looks different to me, because they look pretty similar to me. But this is something that they would look at when they're considering whether or not ammunition was fired from the same gun. And there's another example over here of firing pin impressions as well. And then we also have some more examples from firearms. We have bullets that have been fired, and these markings on the sides are markings from the lands and grooves inside of the barrel of the gun. And these are all going to be different depending on the gun that fired them. And so they can be compared to known samples to see if those bullets were fired from the gun of the known samples. And then we have the same thing on the right side of the screen as well, where it's looking at more minute detail of expended bullets. And then another particular discipline that deals more with subjectivity is footwear and tire wear impressions, or trace and arson. Sorry, the discipline is trace and arson. And they look at shoe prints from crime scenes. So this impression on the left side of the screen was from a crime scene, and this one was potentially from a suspect that committed the crime, and they can compare these two and determine whether or not that person was at the scene of the crime. And again, this is just an example of, again, on the left side, an impression, a footwear impression left at a crime scene compared to a potential footwear database. Okay, I'm going to start moving a little faster through these slides. So moving on to bias in forensic science, we have different policies that are used to mitigate contextual and confirmation bias. And a bunch of these will be more specific to what I do, since that's what I know, but some of them will also apply to other disciplines as well. As I mentioned previously, we're developing discipline standards for best practices. And again, that's the Organization of Scientific Area Committees. Laboratories can be accredited. The laboratory that I work for is accredited. So we're required to follow particular standards and best practices as a requirement of our accreditation. You can verify all value decisions and conclusions from comparisons, either in firearms or blatant prints, or any other discipline. Contemporaneous and complete note-taking is also helpful. It's important to make sure that as a forensic scientist is conducting their analysis, that they take notes during that analysis so that they know exactly what they did later on when they return to it and when they're on the stand testifying to the results of their analysis. There are complexity models that are used in latent print analysis that demonstrate how complex a particular comparison is. There are also scheduled reviews of cases by management to make sure that the analysts are conducting the work correctly. There are consensus and peer review groups. So if, for instance, in my discipline, if there is a print that examiners are disagreeing on, a conclusion for it can go to peer review where more examiners look at it and consider it and compare it and come to a consensus agreement on whether it was made by that person or whether it was excluded to that person, or whether there just wasn't enough information available to do either. Some additional policy examples are scheduled review of testimony. We want to make sure that when people are on the stand, they're telling the truth and they're actually providing the results of their analysis, and those results aren't biased in any way. Charting of latent impressions and comparisons is also important so that an analyst can remember what they did in a particular case. Annual proficiency tests in accredited labs. Anyway, one of the requirements of accreditation is to have analysts conduct proficiency tests each year. Bias can be limited by limiting the information that's available on request. So when latent print examiners receive comparison requests, they may also receive the individual's name who they are going to compare. We can eliminate this bias potentially by providing a number instead of a person's name, or eliminating other types of contextual bias that are unnecessary. And then we can also limit access to record systems. So we have a system in our lab where we can go into a database and access the case records and all kinds of extraneous information that we don't need to know to conduct our comparison. So we tend to stay out of that system unless it's absolutely necessary to get in there for some type of information. Then of course, it's also important to limit contact between scientists and case agents and detectives. So laboratory accreditation. Reasons that accreditation is important, or reasons to have accreditation. Accreditation is based on a laboratory's technical qualifications and competence for conducting their testing, calibrations, and inspection activities within the scope of accreditation. And what this does is it ensures that standards and best practices are being followed. Laboratories that are accredited, all of those laboratories will follow the standards set forth by that accrediting body. Standards ensure the validity of each practice and its ability to produce accurate test results. And accreditation may require that practitioners be certified, again, that proficiency tests are taken on a regular basis, and that if mistakes arise, that they're corrected in a timely manner. Accreditation does not ensure the absence of mistakes. We're all human, so we're all going to make mistakes at some point in our careers. It just ensures that those mistakes will be corrected quickly. And then there are different independent organizations, third-party organizations that provide accreditation for laboratories. Some interesting statistics that I found when conducting research for this presentation. These were statistics back from 2014. This was the soonest that the most recent that I could find for these particular statistics, but it demonstrates the importance, or it demonstrates that laboratories feel that it's important to have accreditation in place. So during this poll, there were 88% of publicly funded crime laboratories who were accredited. And then of those publicly funded crime laboratories, state crime labs had the highest number of accreditations. Then 98% of crime labs conducted proficiency testing. And this was pretty consistent with similar years as they found. 73% of crime labs were accredited by ASQ Lab, and this has since transitioned to ANAB, which is another organization that accredits laboratories. And then 75% of crime laboratories had written standards for performance expectations, which is important. You want to be able to, again, catch those mistakes and make sure they're documented to prevent them from happening in the future. And in this particular poll, 95% of crime labs had a code of ethics. 72% of labs had at least one certified analyst. 35% of labs conducted random reanalysis of cases, and 10% of labs conducted blind examinations for proficiency testing. And what this means is that when an examiner receives a proficiency test, they aren't aware that it's a proficiency test. It's conducted like regular casework. So they'll be assigned the test by a supervisor with the appearance that it's exactly like the work that they conduct on a regular basis. So one of the standards for crime laboratories or laboratories in general is ISO/IC 17025 and AR 3125, and this is the standard for testing and calibration laboratories. AR 3125, excuse me, is supplemental standards for forensics laboratories. These standards include methods, again, for testing at crime laboratories, as well as those developed or modified by the laboratory itself. They include policies for the general structure, resource, process, and management requirements. And then the general structural management and system requirements pertain primarily to the quality management system and the organization of the laboratory itself. And then the resource and process requirements are generally specific to test reliability and correctness and calibrations of instruments. As I mentioned earlier, AR 3125 is specific to laboratories practicing forensic science. So some additional examples of what these particular standards provide requirements for include training of employees. So we have policies that are in place for how employees should be trained, qualifications of employees, and educational requirements. Again, I think it's AR 3125 that requires that scientists have a hard science degree. Impartiality is something else that's mentioned in these requirements. Validation of new techniques. Anytime a new technique is introduced to the laboratory, it needs to be validated before it's put into practice. Verifications of casework. When I make an ID in a case, it then goes to another examiner who does their own independent analysis of that particular impression. And hopefully they'll come up with the same conclusion that I did. There are technical reviews, care of equipment, security of case records, basically anything and everything that a laboratory needs to do to stay in business is covered in these requirements. So I'll go through this slide fairly quickly. Accreditation process, this is specific to ANAB. When labs are interested in being accredited, they require a quote from the company. Then they put in their application, their documents, so their management system documents as well as their policies and procedures are reviewed. And then there's an on-site assessment. So folks from the accrediting agency will go into the laboratory and make sure that the analysts and the laboratory management are doing what they say they're doing, essentially. And following that on-site assessment, there will be a resolution of non-conformity. So anything that the assessment team finds that is not consistent with what they have in place that's written, they'll go in and they'll have them correct that to make sure either the policies fit what they're doing or that they change what they're doing to fit the policies. And then an accreditation decision is made, and there's continual conformance monitoring and reassessment on a regular basis to maintain that accreditation. So it's not just a one-time thing. It's a reassessment every few years to make sure that the laboratory is still following the best practices and the standards that are set forth through their accreditation. Okay, we're going to go through these next few slides fairly quickly, but I wanted to at least give you a better idea of how all of this applies to a discipline. And so we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into latent print analysis and what I do and how all of this quality stuff applies to that specifically. And as I was putting this presentation together, I thought that this cartoon was pretty accurate for our discussion on quality practices. It says the suspect is roughly 40 to 45 feet tall, and we all know that fingerprints are not that large, but it speaks to the importance of having images scaled. So when I receive a print for comparison in our database that's been photographed, it's important that it be scaled. So I know that, so I know what I'm looking at, and I know the size of the print, because the size of the print can indicate, for instance, whether it's a male or a female. Females generally have smaller hands and fingers than males do. Granted, no male is going to have a fingerprint that size, but it gives you an idea of some of the quality things that we need to consider. So fingerprints, latent prints, and inked prints. A fingerprint is an impression of the friction-rich skin present on the fingers. So if you look at your fingers and your palms and your toes and your feet, you'll notice that there is rich skin on them. And this rich skin looks a little bit like Ruffles potato chips. So if you have any type of residue on your fingers when you touch a surface, that residue is then transferred in a two-dimensional impression of those ridges onto the surface. And as I mentioned before, it's oftentimes invisible until it's developed with chemicals or powders or forensic light sources. Let's see. An inked print is an intentional recording of the friction-rich skin, mostly done using live scan or black printer's ink. So when an inked print is recorded, black printer's ink will be applied to the surface of the palm as well as the fingers. And then that printer's ink will be applied to a contrasting surface, usually a white piece of paper. And again, a two-dimensional impression of those friction ridges is left behind. And there's actually an example here of what a 10 print record would look like. You'd have the 10 rolled fingers at the top and then plain impressions or pats at the bottom. So the methodology that we follow for comparisons is ASQ. It's analogous to the scientific method being observation, formation of a hypothesis, testing, results, and verification or validation, or being able to repeat that whole process again. So ASQ stands for analysis, comparison, evaluation, and verification. During the analysis phase, I'll analyze a latent print to determine its suitability for comparison. And some of the things that I consider are the 3 levels of detail within the print. Level 1 detail is the pattern type. Is it an arch? Is it a loop? Or is it a whorl? And if it's not a fingerprint, I'll look at the ridge flow. Is the ridge flow straight or is the ridge flow curved? I'll also look at level 2 detail to include minutia and Galton details. And over here, you can see what some of those look like, where here's an enclosure, there's a bifurcation where a ridge splits into 2 here, there's an ending ridge here. And we use those features during our comparison of the unknown to the known print. And then level 3 includes things such as pore shapes and ridge edge shapes as well. So sometimes those level 3 details are present and sometimes they're not, but when they are, we can use them in our comparison. And with all of this detail, it speaks to why it's important to take contemporaneous and accurate notes, because we want to make sure that we capture what we see, because when we're on the stand, we're not necessarily going to be able to look at that latent print that we compared, we need to make sure that our observations are recorded in our notes so we can accurately testify on the stand as to what we saw. So here are some examples of the pattern types, an arch, a loop, and a whirl again. And then there are combinations of those as well, but these three are the main three classifications. And then level 2 detail to include ridge endings, and then bifurcations, and then dots. Oops. Let's go back. And some of the other detail that we see are sometimes trifurcations, where a ridge will split into 3. Short ridges, enclosures, spurs, ridge crossings, where ridges cross. There's a plethora of different formations we can see. And then again, level 3 detail, the ridge characteristics, such as the pore shapes, like these are the pores here, and then the ridge edge shapes as well, with the little nooks and crannies there. Then we also look at creases on the fingers as well as the palms, and any scars that might be visible, because scars are permanent features. And then incipient ridges, these guys here are incipient ridges. They are immature ridges that didn't fully develop at the cessation of friction ridge development, or that weren't fully developed at the cessation of friction ridge development. During the comparison phase, we will conduct a side-by-side comparison of the unknown to the known, or the latent to the exemplar. And we'll look for features that are easy to pick out in the latent print, and then look for those same features in the known print, and then conduct our comparison of the ridges from there. And we'll look for both similarities and differences during our comparison. We're not just looking to find similarities. We're not just hoping for an identification. We need to remain objective in our comparisons and know that we're not going to be able to ID everything that we see, because not everything comes from the same source. And then the third phase of that is evaluation, drawing a conclusion based on the data collected in the comparison phase. And there are 3 different conclusions at this point. OSAC is actually working on a standard for an expanded conclusion scale, but until that happens, we will continue following these. Identification occurs as a result of sufficient detail and agreement to conclude that the impressions, the latent and the known exemplar, originated from the same source. Exclusion basically says that there's not enough detail, similar detail between the two to determine that they originated from the same source. And then an inconclusive basically says that there's not enough information to go either way. There's some similar information, but there's also some dissimilar information. And then verification is done by another competent examiner, and they conduct their own independent analysis of what the original examiner did. And going into that verification, it's the goal of the second examiner to falsify the original examiner's conclusion. So if they have an ID, they're going to do what they can to try and show that it's not an ID. And this in itself prevents bias. If they can go in and try and prove the opposite hypothesis instead of proving what the examiner's already suggested, it prevents confirmation bias. And if the data does not support a different conclusion, the second analyst has no choice but to verify that original conclusion. If the verifying examiner does not agree with the original examiner's conclusion, there may be an option for a second verification, depending on how labs do this, conducted independently by a third examiner. And then there's also the option for a consensus group regarding that particular comparison. And as I mentioned previously, these are examples of quality control measures that we have in place to make sure that mistakes are mitigated. And then some organizations require that there is 100% verification of all conclusions. So that means value conclusions, whether a print is a value for comparison, as well as conclusions of comparison, whether it's an ID, an exclusion, or inconclusive. And this is another example of a quality control measure to ensure that results remain consistent. So what can alter the appearance of fingerprints? Some distortion factors include substrate distortion, matrix distortion, so what the print is deposited on, what was on the fingertips at the time that the print was left behind, developmental media distortion, deposition pressure, how the person was touching the surface and with what amount of force that person was touching the surface when the print was left behind. Those types of things will affect how a print looks when it's viewed by a latent print examiner. Some red flags include thick ridges. So when we see thick ridges, it's a generally good indicator that the print was left behind with a lot of pressure. Some misaligned ridges might indicate that there was a double tap or overlay of friction ridges. Smudging, unnatural ridge flow, or other indicators of distortion. So obtaining fingerprint evidence. So as I kind of touched upon before, when I am getting ready to conduct my examination, I will either receive latent prints from officers or photographs from evidence processing, or photographs and or lifts from crime scene response. And this is just an example of a print that was developed on a gun. So APHIS, searching the database. So when we enter prints into APHIS, only impressions that are deemed of high enough quality for APHIS are entered into the system. We look for things such as orientation, pattern type, a certain number of minutiae, and if we have fewer minutiae that we're considering for entry, we'll look for higher specificity or uniqueness of those minutiae. The impressions are then coded by the system or manually by the analyst based on the impressions level 2 detail. And again, level 2 detail are those ridge path deviations such as bifurcations or ending ridges. The system assigns an X, Y, and theta value to each point that is marked. The APHIS system only sees the constellation of X, Y, and theta values, not the actual image. And I think it's the next slide that'll show you kind of what the system sees versus what the examiner sees. Oh, maybe the one after that. So when I'm marking prints, the head is marked over the feature itself, and then the tail goes in the direction of the ridge flow. So ending ridges here, a bifurcation here, an island or a dot there. And then we don't mark the shorter features. If the actual marker is longer than the feature itself, we don't mark it because it throws the system off. So when we enter a print into APHIS, the image that you see on the left side is what the examiner sees. The examiner sees both the latent impression that was scanned into the system with all of the features that they've marked up or have allowed the system to mark up. And then APHIS only sees those markings that the examiner placed or the system placed. And then it'll go in and it will compare the spatial relationships of all those markings and the values of those markings, and then come up with the closest candidates based on those markings. So then we don't actually see this as examiners. This is all behind the scenes in the system based on those X, Y, and theta values. But this could be an example of what the system sees with each of those markings that the examiner has put on that particular impression. And then it's compared to a digitized fingerprint, which may have all of these different values. And these are for different fingers. So each column is a single finger, values for a single finger. So when we receive candidates back, the analyst does an on-screen comparison of all candidates to determine source association. And just because we receive a list of candidates back does not mean that that the latent and a candidate from that candidate list will be from the same source. It's important to note that APHIS does not determine the conclusion, as you might have seen in CSI. That is false. The examiner is responsible for determining whether or not those impressions do in fact match. It's important to remember that the system only sees numbers and constellations. It doesn't see everything connecting those points that have been marked. It's only the examiner that can see that. Which brings us to our next slide. On the left side, we have an impression that an examiner could have potentially hypothetically entered and marked up the different points. And then on the right side, we have a potential candidate with minutia of similar spatial relationships. When you remove the actual image, you can see that the spatial relationships are the same and the number of minutia that has been marked is the same. But when you look at the actual impressions, you can actually see that they're different impressions. We've got an ending ridge here and here, but then in this one, there's another one here when there isn't one here. And there are actually several other differences throughout that as well. But again, it's important that the examiner takes the time to go through those candidate lists for this exact reason, which is another quality control measure. We don't just want to assume that the system is giving us back a hit, when in fact, the system could believe that it's a hit and it's actually not. So again, the analyst will conclude hit or no hit, and then the analyst will confirm that hit via manual comparison. And there will be a verification that takes place to confirm that hit. And I have just a couple more slides left. So again, quality is important in forensic science. Quality management ensures that the integrity of evidence is maintained. We have a chain of custody for all of our evidence, and we know where it came from when we receive it. Case notes are taken contemporaneously and are accurate. Bias during analysis is mitigated. Reports are complete and accurate. Process errors are prevented, and if they arise, they are resolved quickly. Any risk is mitigated. Best practices are followed. And having a quality program in place also encourages efficiency in practice. So I had a couple of forensic science success stories. I don't know that I'm going to go over, well, I'll go through these quickly. So this one was from a 1978 cold case from the Nebraska Police Department. There was a 61-year-old man that was basically found dead in his apartment. Latent prints were lifted from the bathroom in his apartment. And essentially what happened is there was no hit to those latent prints that first time they were run through the system. So the case went cold. And 30 years later, those prints were entered into IAFIS, which was the FBI's system for searching prints, and they came back with a hit. Jerry Watson was identified to a print, and he was serving time for another crime someplace else. The evidence was further analyzed, and a DNA match was obtained as well. And as a result of that hit and that DNA analysis, this individual received a sentence of life in prison. So it is good to go back because of technology and reanalyze cases that were analyzed years ago to make sure that we're able to catch hits that wouldn't have been found then due to technology. And in this case, basically the same thing happened at the end, where the case went cold because a hit wasn't determined in the original AFIS search. And then years later, it was entered into IAFIS, which is the FBI's system, and it hit to an individual. And that individual ended up receiving life in prison as well. And this one's kind of the same thing, where there was another murder, and because of the improved technology, this individual was also incarcerated at a much later time. Okay. And I realize we're running tight on time, so I kind of rushed through those last couple of slides. But if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I know that's a lot of material. It kind of covered a lot during this presentation. So So yes, now it's time for questions. If you have any, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, Hilary?
And we don't actually use our DNA section to determine who steals lunches at the lab. Hopefully there aren't any lunches being stolen.
So Hilary,
Yes.
what would you say you miss, cities, large cities and large populations probably have very extensive labs. And you
Yes.
say places like Cholo or Greer or something probably don't even have labs. So if you created crime, let's say in the rural areas versus the cities, do you think there's more false positives in the cities because of maybe backlog, those sort of things? Or how would you sort of rate it between the accuracy between a small town and a big city?
That's a really good question. So I will say that sometimes there's additional bias introduced if you have examiners that are working in those smaller cities, because if they conduct verifications, they're always verifying each other's work. So they've become used to the other person's practices, almost to the point where they may not feel that they need to look at their work or look at it as closely as they would with someone else. Another thing to consider is that smaller agencies will often send their evidence to larger agencies for analysis. So if they don't have the forensic staff available at the smaller agencies, they can send their evidence to county for those crimes that need evidence analyzed, or some other jurisdiction that's near them.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a really good question. There can be bias introduced when you have those smaller labs, because you're having the same people conduct the original analysis and then conduct the verifications.
Right.
In the lab I work for, we have one extra step in that process where we rotate verifiers on a regular basis. So you're not always looking at the same person's work. You're constantly having to get used to how another person does things, so you can't get stuck in a rut.
Interesting.
Well, thank you for your presentation, Hilary. I have a couple questions, but I'm going to just ask one and take any from the audience. So you mentioned you're a certified quality auditor. Do you know, are you aware, are there any certified quality technicians, CQTs, in your department?
I am not aware of that. I don't know.
Okay, because they obviously would be certified to work on test equipment, and just curious if you had any and how many of them might be CQTs.
Right. Well, my particular section doesn't have test equipment, so if that was the case, it would be someone in another discipline.
Okay, all right. Anybody else have a question for our guest speaker? You can either open your own mic or feel free to chat, and I will redirect it. Okay, let's see one. Okay, I'll ask my follow-up question. So I know you work in the latent print area, but with respect to your part of the presentation on guns and ammunition, do you see a rising problem, challenge in the metropolitan area you're at with these ghost guns, these 3D printed guns with no serial numbers? And how would the forensic science get involved here, and what tests might they perform?
Oh, goodness. That's a very good question, but it's not my area of expertise, unfortunately. So I don't have a good response to that.
Okay. Well, I appreciated your presentation with all the quality aspects to it with respect to running diagnostics and the problem you have with test methods, bias, and sensitivity, and need to make sure that your system is stable over time in a wide variety of environments. That was very good. Just curious, if I may. So you work in latent fingerprints. Have you yourself ever been to the field to collect the samples, or is your job mainly in the lab to analyze the samples presented to you?
So mainly I am in the lab. I have been to the field. When I first started in my position, one of the things that's required during the training is shadowing other disciplines so that we can see how it's done. It helps provide a complete picture of the analysis that we do. But I've also, I regularly participate in the internal audits of the laboratory. So during those, I've gotten to go to the crime scenes as well and see how the evidence is collected and brought back to the laboratory.
Very good. One more call for any questions from our audience. Otherwise, I guess I'll go
Hilary,
ahead.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm fascinated with the accreditation process for forensic lab because I come from a medical clinical lab and we're accredited by, you name it, College of American Pathologists, FDA, you name it. When you're doing your proficiency testing, I would presume that the accrediting agency provides those proficiency samples to you. Is that correct?
They don't. We have other testing. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank right now. We have other organizations that provide us with our testing materials for proficiency tests.
Okay. And a follow-up question to that is, I see that you're a certified quality auditor, as am I. And I was curious if you volunteer to do assessments of other forensic laboratories that are accredited, or is that something that you use your CQA for?
I do actually conduct assessments of other laboratories. I was at an assessment in Florida a few weeks ago now. So I do that as well as the internal audits for the laboratory that I work for. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I see Savitri Demon has raised his hand. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Hello. It was great presentation. I really enjoyed it, but I have a question, actually two questions. Number one is, now to get into that line of work, does one have to do a bachelor's in forensic science and then become and do what you're doing, or can somebody just have an engineering degree and take courses to do what you're doing? And the second question is, when like I watch a lot of crime shows, so I wanted to know how accurate is television to what is being done in real life?
Okay, those are both very good questions. Thank you. So most places now, most forensics laboratories now will look for people who have a hard science degree. So that could be a biology degree, a chemistry degree, a degree in forensic science, specifically anthropology, any type of natural or hard science. But a lot of people nowadays also have master's degrees in one of those particular areas as well. Our accreditation at the lab, like the supplemental accreditation requirements that I was talking about earlier, does require certain degrees for certain disciplines. So if labs are accredited, that's definitely something that they need to consider when they're hiring their folks. And the second part of your question was about how true to life it is. Is that correct?
I think that's what I heard. Yep.
Okay, I'm just making sure.
Yes, that was my question, because I watch a lot of television, and in shows like CSI, they'll always talk about, they do a lot of forensics. So I just wanted to know, when you watch or when somebody watches shows like CSI, how accurate is it?
Yep, excellent question. So a lot of the things that you see on there, like they'll do some of the things that I do, where they'll scan a print into the database to search it for a potential match. But what I do isn't quite as fancy. So they'll come back on TV, they'll come back with all the bells and whistles and say, we've got a match here. Like the system will do it in some instances and say, this is the person you want to go after. And as forensic scientists, we're actually required to double check what the system tells us. So if we decide that the system did in fact give us a candidate who could be a potential match, we then need to go and manually compare that exemplar to the latent that we entered into the system. The other part of it is that the gadgets, like some of the gadgets that you see it in the shots of crime scenes aren't quite as fancy as what we actually have, but what we use definitely works. I think they try to make it appear more, I don't know if appealing is the right word, but exciting than what is actually true to life and going on. But in general, what they show you is kind of how we test things and how we collect things. It's more dramatized on those shows. And like I was saying about the CSI effect in court, we don't always collect the evidence at crime scenes that people would expect us to collect based on those shows or based on seeing those shows, either because it's just not available at the crime scenes or because that's not a general practice to collect it. So there are definite differences between reality and the shows.
I just have a follow-up question to that. So is it accurate that that you always see on CSI shows, not that I want to make this whole discussion about television, that they'll always wipe off the fingerprints. So can you just wipe them off and then there'll be no more fingerprints?
You
You always see
can.
them wiping off things, the criminals.
Oh, you're talking about the criminals. Yes, you can. But I mean, latent fingerprints are very fragile. They're basically just whatever happens to be on your skin at the time that it touches the surface. So usually that's just sweat or oils from your body. I mean, it could be dirt from something that you've touched, but once that impression is deposited with that material that you have on your fingers, I mean, if you spill water onto that surface, say it's a table and you spill water, that print can be washed away. If it's on a car, like on the surface of a car, like the roof of a car, that print could dry out while that vehicle is in motion, and whatever matrix, say it's dirt that's stuck to the oils or the sweat that left that print behind, that can fly off with the wind as the car's in motion. So yes, fingerprints are very fragile. They can be wiped off of things, and you don't always leave one behind. You're not always going to have something on your hands that will transfer to a surface and leave a print behind.
And has the use of sanitizer gel affected the ability for you to do because people are always sanitizing their hands?
That's an excellent question. I have not thought of that myself, but if I had to come up with a quick response, I would say that it does affect it. I haven't seen the direct results, but because hand sanitizer is like a majority alcohol dries out your skin. And so it'll dry out whatever you have on the surface of your hands, and it'll prevent any type of transfer occurring from touching a surface. That's a good question.
I saw that on television, which just goes to show you how much television I watch. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
trying to unmute myself. There we go. Well, thank you again, Hilary, for a very engaging presentation. Now we all are a little wiser and smarter about CSI and forensic science, I guess, not so much CSI, the show, but forensic science, and appreciate that. It's always a good diversion from our normal day-to-day lives. So it's fun to hear from another corner of the universe and experiences. So this is just a reminder that the email will be coming out shortly from our Voice of Customer Chair, John Lindland. It will have a survey link. Please score your thoughts and reactions to today's presentation, as well as their RU certificate for additional credits. Just a note about next month's speaker, January 13th is the second Thursday of the month. We will have Ricardo Martinez presenting and present on the topic of enterprise quality performance, a turnaround. And one of the examples I believe he'll be talking about is the NUMMI project, NUMMI, which was a collaboration between Toyota and General Motors to build, I think it was the Saturn vehicle in California at a GM plant. But it's going to talk about overall enterprise quality and how it affects organizational performance. So that's what we have to look forward in January. And just give you a reminder that we do have a partner organization called SWAY. They have a free webinar every third Thursday. The next one is coming up next week. It'll be on the topic of strategic planning and how you can use it to stimulate innovation. So John Gorkum will be discussing different actions that your organization can take to jumpstart your strategic planning process. Also coming up is a RAMS conference. It's the ASQ Annual Reliability and Maintainability Symposium. It will be held in Tucson, Arizona, January 24th through the 27th. If you'd like to learn more about that conference, there are links below. And for some reason it's skipping around. So you see if there's a register now, or you can just type in and do a search for RAMS, and I'm sure you'll find the information there. And then, as I mentioned at the opening of tonight's program meeting, there is the annual Lean Six Sigma conference coming to town in late February, early March. Not only to advertise that you can register for the event, but also for those of you interested in earning additional RUs by volunteering at that conference. I believe the count was 32 volunteers needed. Now their count is based on half days, but we're still working with that and how to get volunteers signed up. We will be sending out more information. So if you are interested, please stay tuned, and we'll provide more information in the coming weeks about that conference. And finally, I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to serve as your chair these last 2 years. It's been an honor and privilege. And I think we've done an excellent job as your section leadership team in delivering high valued content, and hopefully we are helping you to develop and hone your quality skills and your career path. With that, I would like to thank everybody and wish you all a happy holidays, and we'll see you in January. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks all.